Close your eyes. Transport yourself. Go back to November of 1717. It is bitterly cold. We are in Weimar, Germany. If you were to walk into the county judge's chambers, specifically into the small detention room known as the Landrichter chamber, you would find a man sitting alone in a cell. It is a stark image. It is freezing. This is not some romantic poet's tower. It is a holding cell. The man inside is not a thief. He is not a murderer. He is not a revolutionary plotting against the government. No, he is a court organist, and his name is Johann Sebastian Bach. This reality completely shatters the image. When most of us hear the name Bach, we have a calcified image in our heads. We see the marble statue, the stern, heavy-set man in the white peruke wig, the old Bach, the father of Western music, who looks like he was born 70 years old. We see the monument, not the man. We see the bust on the piano teacher's shelf. But here, right at the start of our story, we have a 32-year-old Bach sitting in a jail cell for nearly a month. A month. The reason he is there sets the tone for everything we are going to discuss. He was thrown in prison by his boss, Duke Wilhelm Ernst. His crime? The court records use specific wording. He was jailed for stubbornly forcing the issue of his dismissal. He was jailed for trying to quit his job. He was jailed for not taking no for an answer. You have to remember that in 1717, this is basically the feudal system. He was not an employee in the modern sense. He was a servant. He belonged to the court. You did not just hand in your 2 weeks' notice and clear out your desk. But what defines Bach, what we will see again and again, is that while he might have been a servant on paper, he certainly did not act like one. He had a temper, a massive temper. He was obstinate. He was proud. He knew his worth, even if the world around him treated him like a footman. And the best part of this jail story is that he did not just sit there sulking. No. While he was locked up, disgraced, probably freezing in that room, he was working. He likely began composing parts of the Well-Tempered Clavier, or the Orgelbüchlein. It is the ultimate example of his focus. He could shut out the chaos of the world, even a prison cell, and create this perfect mathematical order on the page. He turned his incarceration into a workshop. That is our mission today. We are going to tear down that statue of the boring old guy in the wig. We want to find the real Johann Sebastian Bach, the orphan, the brawler, who got into actual street fights, the grieving husband, the father of 20 children, the hard-working artisan who probably did not even know he was a genius. He definitely would not have used the word genius. He would have called himself a craftsman, a hard-working one at that. Before we dive deeper into the archives here at History Titans, take a moment to join our ranks. If you want to uncover the true stories behind the legends, hit that subscribe button and share this story with a fellow history lover. Now, let us look at the man's own words. Bach famously said, "I was obliged to be industrious. Whoever is equally industrious will succeed equally well." This is the understatement of the millennium. Just work hard, and you can write the St. Matthew Passion. Simple as that, Sebastian. We have a massive stack of sources here to prove it. Biographies, letters from the Weimar court, records from his time in Cöthen and Leipzig, and analysis of his family life. We must go back to the very beginning. To understand Bach, you have to understand that he did not just choose music. Music chose him. His genetics chose him. To understand the man, you must understand the Bach name itself. Today, if you say Bach, you mean Johann Sebastian. But in Thuringia in the late 1600s, if you said Bach, you did not mean a specific person. You meant a profession. You meant musician. It was the family trade. In that region of Germany, the name Bach was literally synonymous with musician. And just like you would have a family of bakers or blacksmiths, the Bachs were musicians. It stretches back for generations. His great-great-grandfather, Veit Bach, was a bread maker, but he played the lute while the mill was grinding. He played to the rhythm of the millstone. That is the story. He felt the rhythm in his work. From there, the family business exploded. It is staggering when you look at the family tree. Uncles, cousins, brothers. They were all town musicians, organists, cantors. It was a guild. Johann Sebastian was born in Eisenach in March 1685. the youngest of 8 children. His father, Johann Ambrosius, was the town musician. From the moment he could walk, he was surrounded by instruments. The house must have been a cacophony, constantly full of music rehearsals, instrument repairs, theory lessons. He likely learned the violin from his father very early on. He did not have to go looking for music. It was the air he breathed. But this musical childhood did not last long. We often think of these great figures as having destined, ever-rising paths. But Bach's beginning is marked by severe trauma. It is a tragic beginning. By the time Sebastian was 10 years old, he was an orphan. 10. His mother died in 1694. His father followed just 8 months later. That is unimaginable. 10 years old, losing both parents in less than a year. The psychological impact of that is massive. Your entire world just vanishes. You have to wonder if that need for order, that obsession with controlling sound and structure that we see in his later music, comes from this early chaos. His world fell apart. So he spent the rest of his life building these intricate, perfect structures that could never fall apart. After the parents died, the family network, the guild, stepped in. Sebastian was sent to live with his eldest brother, Johann Christoph, in a town called Ohrdruf. Johann Christoph was an organist, a good one. He was a student of the great Pachelbel, the canon in D Pachelbel. This is where Bach really starts his formal training, but it is also where we get one of those famous stories that truly defines his character, the Moonlight manuscripts. It feels like something out of a movie. His brother, Johann Christoph, had a collection of valuable music, scores by the masters of the day, Froberger, Carroll, Pachelbel, the good stuff. These were handwritten copies, rare, expensive. Johann Christoph kept them locked away in a cabinet, with a grill, a lattice door. He explicitly forbade the young Sebastian from touching them. He said, "Do not touch this knowledge." Maybe he was protective of the expensive paper. Maybe he was a little jealous of the boy's exploding talent. Or maybe he just thought a kid was not ready for the heavy stuff. But to a kid like Bach, this is basically a challenge. You do not tell a genius no. Telling Bach no is the surest way to get him to do something. Sebastian would sneak down at night. His hands were small enough that he could manage to pull the rolled-up manuscript through the holes of the lattice door. He could not use a candle. That would wake his brother, or worse, burn the valuable paper. So he copied the music by moonlight. By moonlight. The eye strain alone is agonizing. You are straining to see black ink on paper in very low light. He did this every moonlit night for 6 months. That is dedication. It is obsession. It is a voracious hunger to absorb the data, the musical code. He wanted to know how these composers built their music. He was reverse engineering the masters. But here is the kicker. When his brother eventually found out, he did not admire the drive. He confiscated the copy. He took those 6 months of painstaking work and locked them up. That is harsh. But it highlights that drive to absorb music, no matter the obstacle. Sadly, it also foreshadows the vision problems he would have later in life. Straining his eyes in the dark for months on end could not have helped. Eventually, that hunger took him out of that small town, Thuringian bubble. When he was 15, he secured a spot at St. Michael's School in Lunenburg. This is a huge move way up north. And the key here is that he walked. We are going to hear a lot about Bach walking. Necessity, mostly. If you could not afford a carriage, you walked. But Lunenburg changed everything. Up until this point, he had been in central Germany, which was musically insular. In Lunenburg, he was exposed to a much broader range of culture. He heard French styles, Italian styles. He met sons of aristocrats. It was his first real taste of the wider European world. That exposure sets him up for his first real jobs. This brings us to the next chapter of our story, the rebel. He lands a job in Arnstadt in 1703. He is 18 years old. He has a steady paycheck and a brand new organ to play. It sounds perfect. It should have been. But this is where we meet the rebel with a temper. Bach was young. He was incredibly talented. And he was arguably arrogant. He knew he was good. He had very high standards, and he had zero patience for anyone who could not meet them, especially his students. As part of his contract, he was required to direct the student choir. Apparently, they were not very good. These were local boys, roughly the Bach's own age. They were not as disciplined as he would have liked. This leads to the infamous nanny goat incident. Looking at the sources, this is a classic Bach anecdote. It humanizes him. There was a student named Jailbird, a bassoonist. One evening, Bach and his cousin are walking through the market square. Jailbird and a group of his friends confront Bach. Jailbird is holding a stick. He demands to know why Bach had insulted him earlier. Due to the insult, Bach had called him a zippel faggotist. Faggotist means bassoonist. Zippel implies something like a nanny goat bassoonist, or a weenie bassoonist. It was a derogatory term, implying his playing sounded like a bleeding goat. So the student comes at him with a stick. They get into a full-blown street brawl. But here is the detail people forget. Bach draws his sword. He was carrying a sword. Court musicians often wore swords as a mark of status. It distinguished them from common servants. So Bach draws his blade. They wrestle and fight until other people break it up. Think about that image. Johann Sebastian Bach, the guy who wrote Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, getting into a sword fight with a bassoon student in a market square. It shows his fire. The church authorities were not amused. They reprimanded Jailbird for the assault. But they also told Bach he needed to learn to get along with people. They told him to be more moderate. Moderation was not really his thing. Shortly after this, in 1705, he asks for 4 weeks of leave. He wants to go to Lübeck to hear the famous organist Dietrich Buxtehude. Buxtehude was the rock star of the organ world. He was old, about 70, but his concerts, his Abendmusiken, were legendary. Bach had to learn from the master. So he walks, again. He walks about 260 to 280 miles to get there. That is like walking from London to Paris, in 18th century shoes, in late autumn. It would have taken him 10 to 14 days of solid walking each way, through rain, through mud, through the biting cold. It shows physical stamina, certainly, but more than that, it shows a desperation to learn. He needed to hear this music. He needed to understand how Buxtehude did it. Once he got there, he did not exactly stick to the schedule. He was supposed to be gone for 4 weeks. He stayed for 4 months. He effectively ghosted his job. He was so absorbed in learning from Buxtehude, the improvisation, the complexity, the drama, that he just did not go back on time. He risked his livelihood for his art. His priorities were totally skewed towards artistic growth over employment stability. When he finally dragged himself back to Arnstadt, the congregation was not thrilled. The records show the church council complained that his organ playing had become too complex. He was introducing strange tones and extraordinary variations. He was confusing the congregation. Think about a hymn. Now, it is supposed to be simple, so everyone can sing along. Bach, fresh from Lübeck and full of Buxtehude's influence, was reharmonizing the melody. He was adding crazy complex flourishes between the verses. He was changing the key. The people in the pews were lost. They could not find the tune. He was literally too good for his audience. He was pushing boundaries that they did not even know existed. He was turning a functional service accompaniment into high art, and they just wanted to sing their hymn. Unsurprisingly, he moves on. He takes a job in Mulhausen in 1707. This is where his personal life takes a big step forward. He gets married to Maria Barbara Bach. Yes, his second cousin. It was not uncommon at the time, especially in those tight-knit professional communities. Maria Barbara was the daughter of Johann Michael Bach, another organist. It was a love match by all accounts. Professionally, Mulhausen started well. He wrote a cantata, Gott ist mein König, God is my King, which was actually printed in his lifetime. That was rare, very rare. It was incredibly expensive to engrave copper plates. Printing meant you thought it had commercial value or long-term significance. But Mulhausen was a fleeting moment. The real drama and the real musical evolution happens when he moves to Weimar in 1708. This is the court musician era. He is hired by Duke Wilhelm Ernst. We met the Duke earlier. He is the one who eventually throws Bach in jail. He was a strict, pious ruler, but he loved music. Bach worked in the Himmelsberg Chapel, the Castle of Heaven. It was a unique space. It had a high dome, and the musicians were placed way up high in a gallery, almost invisible to the congregation below. The music would float down like it was coming from angels. The acoustics were ethereal. This environment encouraged Bach to write very vertical, very spiritual music. But there was another influence entering his life here that changed everything: the Italians. The young prince, Johann Ernst, the Duke's nephew, was a traveler. He was bringing back scores from Amsterdam. Music by Vivaldi. Antonio Vivaldi, the Four Seasons guy. Bach gets his hands on these. We have to understand the contrast here to see why this matters. German music at the time was dense, heavy, contrapuntal. Lots of weaving lines, very intellectual. Vivaldi was different. It was rhythmic. It was propulsive. It had a motor. It had a beat. Bach starts transcribing Vivaldi concertos for the organ. He is dissecting them, figuring out how they work. He is learning how to make themes that are clearer, sharper. You can hear his music change. It gets clearer, more driving. He synthesizes that German density with Italian flair. He is becoming the Bach we know. He is doing well there. He is promoted to Concertmeister in 1714. He is writing a cantata every single month. He is on fire. But then the politics kick in, the career crisis. In 1717, the old Kapellmeister, a man named Drace, dies. Bach has been doing the heavy lifting for years. He is the star. He naturally expects the promotion to the top job. But it is the classic corporate snub. The Duke passes him over. And to add insult to injury, he gives the job to Drace's son, a man of much lesser talent. Nepotism at its finest. Bach is insulted. He is furious. He feels completely undervalued. So he does what he did in Arnstadt. He looks for the exit. He accepts a job with Prince Leopold of Cothen without asking the Duke's permission first. This was a massive breach of protocol. You do not just sign with a new team while you are still under contract. This brings us right back to the hook of our story, the jail cell. The Duke is a proud man. He refuses to accept Bach's resignation. Bach becomes obstinate. He probably made a scene. He probably demanded to be let go. And the Duke responds by arresting him on November 6, 1717. We touched on this at the start, but we need to dig into the significance of the well-tempered clavier, which he was likely working on in there. It is the Old Testament of piano music. But for the listener who might not be a music theorist, why is this such a big deal? What does well-tempered even mean? Though this is a crucial concept. In the old days, keyboards were tuned in a way that made certain keys, like C major or G major, sound pure and beautiful. But if you tried to play in other keys, like F sharp major, they sounded terrible, out of tune, wobbly, like a howling wolf. Composers were severely limited. But a new system of tuning was being developed. Well temperament. It adjusted the spaces between the notes just slightly, so that all keys sounded acceptable. Not perfect, but good enough. Bach wanted to prove this system worked. He wanted to prove it in the most comprehensive way possible. So he writes a piece in C major, then C minor, then C sharp major, then C sharp minor, all the way up the scale. 24 keys. He wrote a prelude and a fugue for every single major and minor key. It was an intellectual and mathematical feat, proving that you could travel through the entire harmonic universe without stopping to retune the instrument. He laid the groundwork for this monumental achievement while sitting in a detention room, in disgrace. It shows that his mind was a sanctuary. No matter what the Duke did to his body, his mind was off exploring these harmonic universes. He is finally released on December 2nd. The record says he was released with recorded disgrace and an unfavorable discharge. So basically, get out and do not come back. He happily packs up his family and heads to Cothen. This brings us to the next chapter, tragedy and masterpieces. Cothen seems like a completely different world. It was a paradise at first. Prince Leopold was young, only in his mid-20s. He was a musician himself. He played the violin and the viola da gamba. He actually loved and understood Bach's genius. He got him. He paid him well. He treated him almost as a friend, not a servant. But there was a catch regarding the type of music he could write. A big one. Leopold was a Calvinist. For those who do not know the theology, how did a Calvinist church service differ from the Lutheran ones Bach was used to? Lutherans loved music. They used it to teach the gospel with elaborate choirs, organs, and orchestras. Calvinists believed that church services should be simple. The focus was on the Word of God. They sang psalms, but they did not want complex cantatas or big organ solos distracting them from the text. So for the first time in his career, Bach is not writing for the church. He has no church duties. He is writing for the court. He is writing secular instrumental music for the prince's entertainment. This is where we get the greatest hits of his instrumental work. Because he did not have to turn out a cantata every Sunday, he could focus on pure instrumental architecture. He writes the cello suites, which are the Bible for cellists, the violin sonatas and partitas, and of course, the Brandenburg concertos. Let us talk about those, because the story behind them is actually kind of hilarious. They are considered some of the best orchestral music ever written. If aliens landed and asked what humans achieved, we would play them the Brandenburgs. But they were originally a job application, a failed job application. In 1721, Bach put together this portfolio of 6 concertos. He sent them to the Margrave of Brandenburg. He wrote a very flowery dedication, basically bowing and scraping, saying, "Please consider my humble talents." He was looking for a new patron. And the Margrave? We have no record that he ever replied. He certainly never paid Bach. The scores were just put on a shelf in the Margrave's library to gather dust. They just sat there. They were not even published until 1849, almost 100 years after Bach died. That is staggering. The Margrave of Brandenburg had the Brandenburg concertos sitting on a shelf and did not even know what he had. To the Margrave, it was just a packet of papers from a Kapellmeister in a small town. It is a powerful reminder of how much of this genius went completely unrecognized in his time. But Cothen was not all instrumental joy. This is where Bach faces his greatest personal tragedy. In 1720, Bach travels with Prince Leopold to the spa town of Carlsbad. It is a long trip. They are gone for the summer. When Bach returns home to Cothen, he walks through his front door, expecting to greet his wife, Maria Barbara. Instead, he finds out she is dead. And not just dead. She had been buried a week earlier. He did not even know she was sick. She was not sick when he left. It was sudden. And because mail traveled so slowly, the news never reached him in Carlsbad. He left a healthy wife and came home to a widower's house with 4 surviving children. The emotional blow must have been crushing. He is standing in the hallway, bags in hand, and his whole life has just collapsed. There is a very strong theory, and many musicians feel this intensely when they play it, that the famous chaconne from the D minor violin partita was written in response to this. The chaconne is a single movement for a solo violin, but it lasts for about 15 minutes. It is immense. It is incredibly intense. It starts with this stark, tragic theme, and then it goes through dozens of variations. It feels like the stages of grief. There are moments of anger, moments of sweet memory, moments of absolute desolation, and then finally, a kind of acceptance. It is often seen as his musical monument to Maria Barbara. But life had to go on. He was a single father with a house full of children. A year later, in 1721, he remarries. He marries Anna Magdalena Wilke. She was not just a housekeeper. She was a pro. She was a highly talented soprano. She was employed at the court in Cothen. She earned a good salary. Actually, she was the second highest paid musician at the court, after Bach himself. She was 16 or 17 years younger than him. But by all accounts, it was a very strong musical partnership. We have the notebook for Anna Magdalena, which is full of pieces she played and copied. She helped him copy his scores. Her handwriting eventually became almost identical to his. They were a team, and a fertile one. They had 13 children together. Combined with the children from his first marriage, Bach fathered 20 children in total. 20 children. That is a small village. Though we have to note the tragedy of the era. Only about 10 of those 20 survived to adulthood. Death was a constant companion in the Bach household. You look at the family Bible, and the list of deaths is just heartbreaking. Still, the house was always full of life. Students, family, and music. Always. So he is in Cothen. He is happy with the prince. He has a new wife. But then the prince gets married. The prince marries a woman. who, according to Bach, had no interest in music. He called her an amusa, someone without a muse. The atmosphere at court changed. The prince spent less time on music and more time with his new wife. Bach realized his golden era there was ending, and he had sons who were growing up. He wanted them to have a university education. Cawthon did not have a university. This leads us to the final and perhaps most famous chapter of his life. Leipzig, 1723. The old Whig years. This is the period most people picture. He becomes the Thomas Cantor, the cantor of St. Thomas School in Leipzig. It was a prestigious civic position in a major commercial city. But here is the humbling fact. He applies for the job, and does the city council hire him immediately? Not even close. He was the third choice. Third. Who were the first two? First, they wanted Georg Philipp Telemann. He was the most famous composer in Germany at the time. He turned it down because his current employer gave him a raise. Then they wanted Christoph Graupner. He wanted the job, but his prince would not release him from his contract. So they were stuck with Bach, literally. The council records actually say, since the best man could not be obtained, mediocre ones would have to be accepted. They called Bach mediocre. That aged poorly. But you have to see it from their perspective. They wanted a modern, fashionable composer. They viewed Bach as a slightly outdated, stubborn organist from a small court. They did not know they were hiring a titan. And the job itself sounds like an absolute grind. It was a brutal workload. He was responsible for the music at 4 grand churches in Leipzig. He had to teach the choir boys not just music, but Latin grammar, which he hated. He had to supervise the dormitories and deal with discipline problems. And he had to provide a new cantata every Sunday and for feast days. Let us unpack that. A cantata is roughly 20 to 30 minutes of music. It involves a choir, soloists, and an orchestra. And he had to write a new one every single week. Imagine the schedule. Monday, maybe you rest or plan the text. Tuesday and Wednesday, you compose writing furiously. Thursday and Friday, the copyists, including his wife and kids, have to write out the individual parts for the violin, the oboe, the singers. Saturday, you rehearse. Sunday, you perform. And then Monday, you start all over again. It is an assembly line of genius. In his first few years in Leipzig, he wrote 5 full annual cycles of cantatas. That is roughly 300 cantatas. We have about 200 left. The others were lost. The sheer output is staggering. And the quality. He was not phoning it in. Some of his most complex, most beautiful music was written on this treadmill. And he was not doing this in a supportive environment. He was constantly fighting with the boss. He fought with the city council over money. They were penny pinchers. He fought with the school rector, Ernesti, over who got to pick the choir prefects. He was writing letters, complaining about the lack of good singers. He called the council niggardly. He was a thorn in their side. But he also found an outlet. So it was not all church music and fighting the council. In 1729, he takes over the secular ensemble called the Collegium Musicum. It was mostly made up of university students, and they performed at Café Zimmermann, a coffee house. Gottfried Zimmermann's coffee house on Catherine Street. Imagine a bustling room, smoke in the air, people drinking coffee, which was a trendy new drug at the time, and Bach is there conducting concertos. This is where the coffee cantata comes from. He wrote a little comic opera cantata about a girl named Lieschen who was addicted to coffee. Her father tells her she has to give it up, or she cannot get married. And what does she say? She sings an aria, saying, "Coffee tastes sweeter than 1,000 kisses." It is a comedy. I love that. Bach in a coffee shop, making jokes about caffeine addiction. It is so relatable. It shows he was not just this stern religious figure. He had humor. He enjoyed life. This gig kept him connected to instrumental music during those long years of church duties. Now we have to talk about the major works from this period. The Passions, the St. John Passion, and the St. Matthew Passion. These are monumental. The St. Matthew Passion, performed on Good Friday, is often considered the peak of Baroque music. It is massive. It uses 2 orchestras and 2 choirs calling back and forth to each other. It tells the story of the crucifixion with such incredible psychological depth. And the Mass in B minor. The Mass in B minor is interesting because he compiled it towards the end of his life in the late 1740s. He never heard it performed in its entirety. Never. It is like a greatest hits compilation of his own work. He took the best music he had written over his career, cantata movements, early works, and reworked them into this massive Catholic Mass. Even though he was Lutheran, it was his legacy project. It was him showing the world and God what he could do. It is a summation of his entire life's learning. Speaking of legacy projects, there is one more famous story from his later years: the visit to Frederick the Great in 1747. This is a clash of worlds. Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, was the ultimate modern ruler. He was Enlightenment. He spoke French. He played the flute. He represented the new style, simple, elegant melodies. And Bach was the old Whig, complex, heavy, counterpoint. So Bach goes to visit his son, C.P.E. Bach, who works for the king in Berlin. Frederick decides to test the old man. He plays a very difficult, a very chromatic theme on the fortepiano, a new instrument at the time, and challenges Bach to improvise a 3-part fugue on it, right there on the spot, which is like asking a rapper to freestyle a dissertation on quantum physics using only words that start with Z. It is a trap. It is designed to be impossible. But Bach sits down and does it. He improvises a brilliant fugue. The king is stunned, but Bach is not satisfied. Not even close. He goes home. He takes that theme, the thema regium, and works it into a massive collection of puzzles, canons, and fugues. He calls it the musical offering and sends it to the king. It is a mic drop. You gave me a puzzle. Here is an entire masterpiece. It is a pure flex. I will show you what the old Bach can do. But by this time, his health was failing. We are in the late 1740s. He was going blind. The years of copying music by moonlight and candlelight had taken their toll. He also most likely had diabetes. This leads to a very tragic end involving a surgeon named John Taylor. John Taylor was a British eye surgeon. By modern standards, he was a charlatan, a quack. He traveled around Europe performing these eye surgeries. He actually operated on Handel as well, and blinded him too. His track record is horrific. He operated on Bach's eyes twice in 1750. It did not go well. It was a complete disaster. The surgeries failed. Bach was left completely blind. And the treatments, which involved bleeding and putting irritating concoctions in his eyes, weakened him significantly. He suffered a stroke and died on July 28, 1750. It is so tragic that the man who saw music with such clarity ended his life in darkness. And what is even sadder is what happened next. Or rather, what didn't happen. He dies. You would expect the world to mourn the loss of a giant, but they did not. To the world of 1750, Bach was old-fashioned. His music was too complex, too intellectual. The new style, the style of his own sons, was simpler, lighter. Bach was forgotten. His manuscripts were sold for pennies. Stories exist of manuscripts being used to wrap butter or sandwiches, or even to start fires. They were just treated as scrap paper. That physically hurts to hear. It was the sleep of his music. For about 80 years, he was known only to connoisseurs. Mozart knew him and studied him. Beethoven called him the original father of harmony. But the public had no idea. So how did we get him back? How did he become the god of music we know today? Felix Mendelssohn. In 1829, Mendelssohn was just 20 years old. He organized a performance of the St. Matthew Passion in Berlin. It was the first time it had been heard since Bach's death. The reaction was immediate. People were stunned, blown away. They suddenly realized what had been lost. It kick-started the Bach revival. Mendelssohn famously said, "It took a Jew to bring the greatest Christian music back to the world. And since then, he has never left. He is the foundation." He synthesized everything that came before him. German counterpoint, Italian rhythm, French dance. He built a structure that Western music still rests on. Before we wrap up, we have to mention his sons, because the Bach name did not die with him. He had 4 sons who became famous composers in their own right. Wilhelm Friedmann, the eldest, very talented but unstable. Carl Philipp Emanuel, or C.P.E. Bach, who was actually more famous than his father during his lifetime. He was the bridge to Mozart and Haydn, and Johann Christian, J.C. Bach, the London Bach, who befriended the young Mozart. It is funny that the sons thought their dad was old-fashioned. Every generation rebels. They wanted to write clear, emotional melodies. Their dad wrote these complex, weaving mathematical puzzles. But eventually, they all came back to looking at what the old Whig had accomplished. So what does this all mean? We have looked at the orphan, the brawler, the prisoner, the grieving husband, the overworked teacher. When you look at the totality of his life, what stands out is the resilience. He faced immense tragedy, losing his parents at 10, losing his first wife so suddenly, losing 10 of his own children in infancy. Yet in the face of all that death and chaos, he created music of perfect order. He signed his scores, Soli Deo Gloria, to the glory of God alone. He believed that music was a way to bring divine order to an imperfect world. And he did it with a stubbornness and a fire that, frankly, got him thrown in jail, but also gave us the St. Matthew Passion. It is a powerful reminder that genius is not always recognized in its own time. Bach was considered outdated when he died. It took 80 years for the world to catch up. It raises a provocative question for us today. Who is the Bach of our time? Who is the genius working in obscurity, maybe considered unfashionable or weird by current standards? Whose work will define our era in 100 years? We might be ignoring them right now. That is definitely a thought to chew on. If you enjoyed uncovering the man behind the music, the guy who fought bassoonists and sat in a jail cell, you are a true History Titan. Don't forget to like and subscribe to History Titans so you don't miss our next exploration into the lives of the giants who built our world. Share this with a friend who thinks classical music is boring. Tell them about the street fight. Thanks for listening.